Well, I respect the move, but the entire thing has been a witch hunt.
Leaving behind domestic turmoil over Russia investigations and an ousted FBI director, Donald Trump sets off on his first foreign trip as US president. Hello, I'm Nathan King, in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. US President Donald Trump takes his first trip abroad as Commander-in-Chief, starting in Saudi Arabia before traveling on to Israel and Europe. But how might domestic issues derail his first foray into foreign policy? Joining us to discuss now is Tara Kangarlou. She's an international journalist focusing on the Middle East. She's in New York. And with me in the studio, Atiba Madyun. He is the president of the Madyun Group and a government relations firm. From Los Angeles, we have Majid Rafizadeh. Sorry, I'll say that again. Majid Rafizadeh. He is president of the International American Council, and James Jatras is a former US diplomat and Republican advisor and strategist here in the studio. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you. Tara, I'm going to start with you. You've covered the Middle East a lot. Is this where you expected candidate Donald Trump to start his first foreign trip, going to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and Israel as well? Tara?
It's a question for me.
Yes.
It's surprising to all of us. You know, we haven't seen that from previous presidents, and I think it's very telling into what his plans are for the months to come. Of course, he has a lot going on the home front back here in the States, but going to Saudi Arabia, a country very much involved with everything that's going on in the Middle East, is pretty telling. And also, remember the peace talks that have not been successful for the previous presidents. This time, President Trump, this deal maker and person who claims to know the art of the deal, is very interested in bringing that home. But we're going to see. There's Yemen at stake. We have Syria going. We have what's going on in Turkey, which is somehow related to the United States relations to Saudi Arabia, and of course Israel's involvement in Syria, as we saw earlier, and let's not forget Iraq. So it's an important trip, and it's one that the world is watching, I think, and it's going to be tipped off with this motto that he's saying over and over: fight against terror, and bringing all these religious players, the Vatican, Saudi Arabia, and Israel and Palestine together in that effort.
Majid, what do you think of this? Because it is not the trip that people envisaged Trump doing as his first foreign trip. And the stakes are quite high: defeating ISIS, bringing Arab countries together, kickstarting the peace process. I think you're having problems hearing me. Let me just turn to you, James. What do you think in terms of the foreign policy campaign that Donald Trump won, and now he's in office? This is not necessarily the trip that many of his supporters would have envisaged.
And I certainly count myself as a supporter, and frankly, I don't think it's a good move for him. I think it would have been an excellent first trip for Hillary Clinton in the White House if she had won the election. You go there and get closer to Saudi Arabia, form a so-called Arab NATO, evidently, that he's going to announce when he's there, which can only point toward more hostility toward Iran and, frankly, more support for jihad terrorists in Syria, which the Saudis are part of the problem, not part of the solution. It seems to me this runs completely counter to what he promised during the campaign and what evidently he tried to work out with the Russians at his meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Let's get our eye on the ball, which is defeating the terrorists. I don't see how getting closer to the Saudis helps us with that.
Right. Atiba, obviously there is a lot going on here in Washington. Is it a good time for him to go? I mean, a lot of presidents in the past have tried to leave domestic problems at home and go on a foreign trip. But there are some pitfalls for Trump when he goes abroad as well, I should imagine.
I think the problems that he faces here has to do with a lot of lies. I mean, what comes to mind is here's the commander-in-chief going to foreign countries to talk with from a diplomatic standpoint. but he's a commander of lies. I mean, what we keep hearing, his credibility, we've been asked several times, like, does he have credibility? I'm wondering, how is this speech going to go across in Saudi Arabia? He was, as a presidential candidate, he attacked Muslims. Where does his credibility lie going into the Middle East and going abroad? I think that a lot of what the White House is saying is that this is going to be a reboot. But is this going to be a reboot, or are the things that he's left behind here going to follow him there? And what he says over there, how is it going to affect him when he gets back home?
Thanks. Majid, let's bring you in here. There was a series of quite comical articles in the press in the last 24 hours about what people are preparing to do in foreign capitals to impress Trump. Apparently, you've got to keep it a short message that you've got to congratulate him on his election victory. What will spell success, do you think, for the president on this first foreign trip, especially when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, there are two issues. First of all, I think you're correct. Saudi Arabia is now very excited that Trump is doing his first trip in Riyadh, and that's sending a strong message, not only to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, and to the Muslim world. So I think two things he can focus on in order to be successful. One, to bridge the gap between himself and the Muslim world because of what was said in the campaign. So that's a very strong platform in Saudi Arabia to do that, and Riyadh is ready, has given him the platform in order to do that. So I think that's very significant. Saudi Arabia decided to forget what he said in the campaign and to build a new era. So that's one thing. And I think the second thing that's very important here, in my opinion, is creating a coalition. First of all, we should not raise our expectation that this is going to lead to resolving all the conflicts in the Middle East. But I think he should try to build a coalition between Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, and not only Arab countries, other countries in the region too. And that creating the coalition is the first step in order to address other issues like the Islamic State, terrorism, and so on.
Tara, there are differing goals, though, between all these countries, even Arab countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, even in their own backyard when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Iraq, what to prioritize in terms of ISIL. Can a new, young president who doesn't have that much experience in the region, let alone foreign affairs, deliver where others haven't?
The Middle East, you need leadership from the Middle East, not a strong and active leadership coming from Washington D.C. interfering in the issues. I think what you need to create that leadership from behind the scene, and I think when you create that coalition, which I mentioned, then countries in the Middle East, and the coalition of several Arab nations and non-Arab nations, including Turkey or Israel and other countries, they can really resolve those issues. So I don't think it needs extensive experience to resolve the issue. And we have in the history, if you look at the American history, there were presidents who did not have any history, but they succeeded in creating peace plans in the Middle East.
James, I want to come to you, but before that, I want to bring in the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, talking about this trip. Let's just play the sound, and then I'll get your reaction off the back.
He's going to the Western Wall mainly in connection with the theme to connect with three of the world's great religions and to advance, to pay homage at each of these religious sites that he's visiting, but also to highlight the theme that we all have to be united against what are really the enemies of all civilized people.
So that's the Middle East. You said in your previous answer that you thought this was ill-defined. He then moves on to the Vatican, but then also Brussels and Sicily for NATO and the G7. What would be success there, or do you think this is ill-advised too, James?
I think it is. Again, I think we're just doubling down on an establishment policy. You know, we're going to make NATO great again instead of making America great again. The three great religions. That's very nice packaging. Maybe that's supposed to designed as some kind of a stature-building atmospheric. He's going to go to Saudi Arabia and give the equivalent of Obama's speech in Cairo to the Islamic world. We see how well that worked out. You can't appeal to people on the one side and then kill many Muslims in many countries on the other side and say, gee, why don't they like us? This notion that we are going to build an anti-terror coalition, with all due respect to my colleagues, we've got a coalition supposedly with the Saudis and Jordanians, the Gulf states, the Turks, and so forth. These are the various countries that have been arming the terrorists in Syria or destroying that country for 6 years. There would not be an ISIS in Syria if not for the Saudis. How are they part of the solution? Right. I think that we're barking up the wrong tree here.
But some would argue, Atiba, that actually this is reassuring, that he's being more presidential in terms of how foreign policy is being conducted before, whether it's Democrat or Republican, than he said on the campaign trail. Do you feel that?
You know, I don't know.
In terms of your clients and everyone you're speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is the president's first speech before Congress. After he gave that speech, the tone that he gave, a lot of people said that he was very presidential, and the next day he went back to being the same person we've gotten to know on the campaign trail. I think that, you know, with him going into the Middle East and meeting with the Saudis and with these 50 leaders, it comes to mind in thinking what's going on here in the United States. I mean, look at the defacing of synagogues. Look at the abuses that have been made against Muslims by everyday citizens. And a lot of that has come down because there's a trickle-down effect from what people have heard from the president. So now the president is going overseas in a diplomatic capacity to talk to others, to talk about building a coalition to fight against what he calls radical Islam. What is it that he has done to show some type of comfort or some type of level of experience working right here within the country? He hasn't addressed any of those issues here, yet he's going to go across to another country, to another continent, and talk about these issues.
Tara, let's pick up on that in New York. He is going to give this speech about terrorism and tolerance in Islam. And this is the same administration that inked the so-called travel ban, which targeted mainly Muslim countries. Is that a little bit of a contradiction here?
Absolutely, but I think if we take a step back and look at what's coming out of the administration with what we're hearing and what we're seeing and what has been promised is very, very much in conflict. So we need to take a step back and look at the reason President Trump is going to Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia has been purchasing a lot of military and arms from the United States, and if you look at the region, it's an incredibly volatile space where their support is going to be needed. So we need to look at that. We need to look at the underlying intentions of these trips. We need to look at the president's policy towards Syria. Everybody got excited after he took very quick action in attacking the bases in Syria, but then what came next? Nothing. There is no policy that we as journalists or analysts can look at and say, okay, if he does this, then it would lead to that. We are not seeing premises that are being followed through. So for me, it's very interesting to hear the conversations that are coming out in these meetings, but also remember, Iran just had an election earlier today. The result of that would have a very, very strong impact on the whole calculus in the region. And you have Saudi Arabia, whose defense minister just this last week came out in a very much in a hostile response to Iran, saying that we don't want any engagement. So President Trump also being critical to that country, now going to Saudi Arabia is going to be very, very telling of the region's policy at large.